The hum was the only thing that felt real, a low, gut-deep vibration that permeated every deck of the Kerberos. A sound so constant that silence had become the true alarm. For Kalen, it was the station's heartbeat, the rhythm of the colossal asteroid grinders chewing through iron and nickel deep in the facility's core. He ran a hand over the pitted surface of a bulkhead, the metal cold and sweating condensation in the recycled air. Decades of dust and grime were caked into its seams, a history written in neglect. This was Tartarus Station, humanity's forgotten foothold in the dust-choked Tantalus Belt, a place where dreams came not to flourish, but to be pulverized into manageable, sellable units of ore. Out here, the galaxy's grand narrative of progress and enlightenment was a joke told by people who slept on planets with real sunlight. Here, there was only the grind, the hum, and the endless, indifferent black. Kalen was a ghost in this machine, a diagnostician whose talent was a curse. He didn't just fix systems, he felt them. He could trace a failing power conduit by the sour tang it left in the air or predict a catastrophic bearing failure by the subtle discordance it introduced into the station's ever-present hum. It was a skill that made him invaluable to the station's aging foreman, a grizzled spacer named Valerius, but an outcast among the other roughnecks who saw his quiet intensity as something unnatural. They preferred the loud clang of a wrench and the certainty of a well-aimed hammer, not the whispering intuition that Kalen possessed. His current obsession was a cascade failure in the tertiary mass driver, a magnetic rail system used to launch refined ore ingots toward the distant shipping lanes. The schematics were a joke, a palimpsest of decades of patchwork repairs, salvaged parts, and outright desperate gambles. No sane engineer would touch it, but Kalen saw the ghost in its machine, the flawed logic of its cobbled-together code. He was tracing a feedback loop, a parasitic energy drain that was slowly bleeding the capacitors dry. When the hum changed, it wasn't a sudden stop or a jarring lurch. It was a subtle shift in pitch, a new, alien harmony layering itself over the familiar thrum of the grinders. Kalen froze, his fingers hovering over the glowing control panel. The air grew heavy, still. Then, the station's external proximity alerts, long dormant and coated in the same layer of grime as everything else, shrieked to life with a sound like tearing metal. He bolted from the engineering crawlspace, his boots clanging on the grated floor as he raced toward the main observation deck. He was met with a scene of chaos. Miners and technicians, their faces pale under the harsh fluorescent lights, were crowded around the thick, armored glass viewport that looked out into the void. Valeria stood at the forefront, his knuckles white as he gripped a railing, his face a mask of disbelief. Kalen pushed his way through the crowd, his eyes drawn to the impossible sight hanging in the blackness. It was a ship, but that word felt inadequate, like calling a supernova a spark. The vessel was a perfect, seamless teardrop of iridescent white material, devoid of any visible engines, weapons, or seams. It didn't reflect the dim light of the distant star. It seemed to absorb it, to drink in the darkness and radiate a cold, sterile luminescence. Its design was an insult to the gritty, functional reality of Tartarus Station. It was a thing of impossible beauty and terrifying perfection. The Ethelian technocracy. Kalen had only ever read about them in filtered data streams, the sanitized histories that painted them as benign, hyper-advanced stewards of galactic order. They were a species that had transcended the messiness of biology, merging with their own perfect artificial intelligence to become beings of pure logic and efficiency. They didn't conquer, they optimized. They saw the chaotic, unpredictable expansion of humanity not as a threat, but as a statistical anomaly. An error in the cosmic equation that needed to be corrected. "What do they want?" someone whispered, the words trembling in the sudden, oppressive silence that had fallen over the deck. Valerius didn't turn. "They've hailed us," he growled, his voice a low rumble, "broadcasting on all channels, in our language." He jabbed a thumb toward a communications console, where a single, elegant glyph pulsed on the screen, the universal symbol of the technocracy. A junior officer, her face barely out of her teens, tapped at the console. "They're sending a message." No video, just text. The words appeared on the main screen, translated from the Ethelian's precise, mathematical language into stark, clinical English. "To the organic occupants of designation Tartarus, your operational inefficiency has been noted. Your resource extraction methods are suboptimal and generate unacceptable cosmic entropy by the mandate of the prime algorithm. This sector is scheduled for systemic recalibration. You're instructed to cease all operations and prepare for relocation to a designated biological preservation habitat. Your compliance is the most logical outcome. You have one cycle." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Preservation habitat. It sounded like a zoo. One cycle, a miner scoffed. What the hell is one cycle? Kalen knew. He'd studied their temporal metrics in the stray data packets he'd managed to decrypt over the years. "About 6 hours, he said, his voice quiet but cutting through the noise. "They've given us 6 hours to surrender our lives." The reality of the ultimatum settled over them like a shroud. The Ethelians weren't negotiating. They were issuing a bug report. Humanity was the glitch, and Tartarus Station was slated for deletion. Valerius turned from the window, his eyes scanning the faces of his crew. These were not soldiers, they were miners, engineers, mechanics, people who fought rock and vacuum, not demigods in perfect ships. Despair was a tangible thing in the air, thick and suffocating. "They think we're just a rounding error," Valerius said, his voice laced with a venomous fury. "A bit of noise they can just clean up." He slammed his fist onto a console. "They think we'll just roll over, that it's the most logical outcome." He looked around the room, his gaze finally landing on Kalen. There was a desperate fire in the old man's eyes. "Kalen, the Forge. Can we do it?" A new silence fell, this one charged with a terrifying impossible hope. The Forge was the station's monstrous heart. It wasn't a ship, it was a mobile refinery, a colossal, asteroid-cracking behemoth that had been dormant for years, cannibalized for parts to keep the station itself alive. It was an ugly, sprawling beast of a vessel, a labyrinth of industrial machinery, ore processors, and smelting vats, all built around a volatile, experimental reactor core that Kalen himself had deemed too unstable to ever safely power up. It was a death trap. It was a tomb. It was their only chance. "Its reactor is a nightmare," Kalen said, his mind already racing, calculating, feeling the ghost of the great machine stir in his thoughts. "The containment fields are shot. The primary conduits are stripped. It has no weapons, no shields, no navigation to speak of. I didn't ask if it was safe." Valerius snapped. "I asked if you can do it. Can you make that pile of junk fight?" Kalen looked from the foreman's desperate face to the perfect, sterile ship hanging in the void. He thought of the Ethelian message, the casual, dismissive arrogance of a power that saw human struggle, human chaos, human life as nothing more than inefficiency. A slow, cold anger began to burn in his chest, eclipsing the fear. He was an expert in flawed systems, in broken machines held together by sheer will and desperation. What was humanity if not the ultimate flawed system? Yes, Kalen said, the word feeling like a vow. But it won't be a warship. It'll be an abomination. The next 6 hours were a blur of controlled chaos. Valerius became a roaring titan, barking orders, organizing teams, turning a despondent crew of miners into a frantic, single-minded army. They swarmed over the dormant hulk of the forge, their cutting torches and plasma welders casting eerie, dancing shadows in the cavernous docking bay. They weren't installing weapon systems, they were repurposing industrial nightmares. The primary ore grinder, a terrifying maw of diamond-tipped teeth designed to pulverize asteroids, was rerouted, its magnetic containment field recalibrated to act as a crude, short-range shield. The massive grappling arms, meant to snag and maneuver kilometer-wide rocks, were fitted with explosive charges on their tips, turning them into brutal, ship-breaking battering rams. Kalen, meanwhile, descended into the hellish depths of the forge's engine room. The experimental reactor was a monstrosity, a fusion of human desperation and stolen, half-understood alien technology scavenged from a derelict freighter decades ago. It didn't hum, it seethed, even in its dormant state. The Athelians worshipped clean, predictable energy. This reactor was the opposite. It was a cage star, a chaotic, violent reaction that produced immense power at the cost of constant, terrifying instability. It was a system that relied on intuition, on feeling the ebb and flow of its fury, something no Athelian algorithm could ever comprehend. Kalen worked like a man possessed, his hands flying across control surfaces, bypassing safety protocols that were meaningless now, jury-rigging power conduits with anything that would hold a charge. He wasn't repairing the system, he was unleashing it, embracing its flaws, turning its instability into a weapon. His masterstroke was the station's main mass driver. With the help of a dozen frantic engineers, they managed to sever the entire magnetic accelerator rail, a cannon hundreds of meters long, and weld it to the forge's spine. It was an ugly, brutal appendage, a scar on the ship's already hideous frame. They had no sophisticated targeting systems, no guided munitions. They only had the raw, kinetic fury of the driver and a stockpile of refined nickel-iron ingots, each one weighing several tons. They would be firing solid slugs of metal at a god, with minutes to spare. The forge roared to life. It was not the clean-cut and silent ignition of an Athelian vessel. It was a scream of tortured metal, a deep, shuddering groan as the unstable reactor ignited, sending waves of raw, untamed power surging through the ship's cobbled-together veins. Lights flickered, entire systems shorted out and then rebooted, and the very air vibrated with a terrifying, discordant energy. Kalen stood on the makeshift bridge, a converted observation deck, his hands resting on a console that fed him the raw, chaotic data from the reactor. He could feel its rage, a wild beast straining against its leash. Through the viewport, he saw the Athelian ship, still hanging silent and motionless in the void. Their 6 hours were up. They're hailing us again, the comms officer said, her voice strained. Same message. They say our failure to comply is illogical. Tell them to go to hell, Valerius grunted, strapping himself into a command chair bolted to the floor. Kalen just shook his head. Logic was a luxury they no longer had. The Athelian vessel made the first move. A sliver of pure white light, no thicker than a needle, lanced out from its hull. It was a clean, precise surgical strike. A weapon that didn't explode but simply unmade whatever it touched at a molecular level. It struck the station they had just abandoned, and a perfect silent sphere of Tartarus Station simply ceased to exist. There was no fire, no debris, just a void where a moment before there had been steel and rock. It was the most terrifying thing Kalen had ever seen. "They're firing again," someone yelled. "At us full power to the grinder field," Kalen roared, pushing the reactor's output into the red. On the nose of the forge, the repurposed asteroid grinder whirred, its magnetic field flaring to life in a chaotic, shimmering aura of raw energy. The Athelian beam struck the field. Instead of being negated, it was diffracted, scattered, its perfect coherence shattered by the unpredictable, brute force magnetism. The forge shuddered, alarm screaming, but it held. For a moment, there was silence. The Athelian ship, for the first time, seemed to hesitate. Its predictive models, its flawless algorithms, had just encountered something that shouldn't be possible. Their perfect weapon had failed against a piece of mining equipment. They don't know what to do. Kalen breathed, a wild, incredulous grin spreading across his face. "They can't compute us." "Then let's give them something else to think about," Valerius bellowed. "Kalen, fire that goddamn cannon." Kalen's hands flew across his console, diverting a massive surge of power from the unstable reactor directly into the mass driver. The entire ship groaned in protest, the lights dimming as the magnetic rails began to glow cherry red. There was no targeting computer. The gunnery officer, a former asteroid driller, aimed by sight, lining up the shot with the practiced eye of a man used to hitting moving targets millions of kilometers away. Fire. The mass driver unleashed its payload with a deafening, bone-jarring concussion that shook the forge to its core. A solid 10-ton ingot of nickel iron, crude and unguided, shot out into the void, tumbling end over end as it accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light. It was the antithesis of an Athelian weapon, a dumb, brutal, kinetic sledgehammer. The Athelian ship, in its perfection, had never anticipated such a primitive attack. Its sophisticated energy shields were designed to deflect plasma, to dissipate laser fire, to neutralize radiation. They were not designed to stop a mountain of metal traveling at relativistic speeds. The ingot slammed into the iridescent hull. There was no clean or sterile erasure. There was a catastrophic, beautiful, and utterly horrifying impact. The seamless hull of the Athelian ship didn't just break. It shattered, cracks spiderwebbing across its perfect surface as the kinetic energy of the blow was transferred throughout its structure. For a split second, it held its shape, a broken porcelain egg hanging in the void. Then, with a silent, blinding flash of internal energy, it came apart. The vanguard of the Athelian technocracy, a vessel of unimaginable power and perfection, was gone, replaced by a glittering cloud of crystalline dust. On the bridge of the forge, there was a stunned, breathless silence. They had done it. They had fought a god and won. But as Kalen looked at the flickering damage reports flooding his console, at the screaming warnings from the overloaded reactor, a cold dread began to seep into his victory. The ship was crippled, bleeding power in atmosphere. They were stranded. And they had just declared war on an empire that saw their very existence as an error in need of deletion. The full fleet, he knew, would be coming now. And it would not be a single ship. The silence that followed the Athelian ship's disintegration was heavier and more terrifying than any sound. It was the silence of a graveyard, a profound and empty quiet that seeped into the very bones of the forge. The victory, so shocking and absolute, evaporated in an instant, leaving behind the bitter ash of its cost. On the makeshift bridge, The crew stared out at the glittering dust cloud, their faces a mixture of awe and stark, primal fear. They hadn't just poked the beast, they had slaughtered its herald. And the silence was the sound of the beast turning its full, unblinking attention toward them. Kalen felt the ship's agony as a physical pain in his own chest. The discordant roar of the reactor had subsided into a ragged, labored wheezing that echoed through the deck plates. It was the sound of a dying leviathan. Alarms, once screaming, now blared in broken, stuttering patterns as system after system cascaded into failure. Red lights flashed across consoles, painting the grim faces of the crew in the color of blood. Status Valerius roared, his voice cutting through the stunned paralysis. The single word was a bucket of ice water, snapping the bridge crew back to a reality that was rapidly collapsing around them. The reports came in a panicked torrent. Hull integrity at 40% and dropping. We're venting atmosphere on decks 7 through 12. Main drive is offline. That last shot must have shattered the primary conduits. Life support is failing. We have maybe 2 hours of breathable air in the sealed sections. And the reactor. The engineering chief's voice crackled over the comm, thick with static and despair. Kalen was right. The containment is fluctuating. It's bleeding hard radiation into the core. It's going to go critical. I don't know when, but it's not a matter of if. Every word was a nail in their coffin. They were a ghost ship, adrift in their own victory, with a dying star for a heart. The crew looked to Valerius, their eyes wide with the question they dared not ask. What now? The old foreman's face was a granite mask, but Kalen could see the tremor in his hand as he gripped the railing. He had led these people in an impossible fight, and now he had to lead them in an impossible death. But Kalen wasn't looking at Valerius. He was listening past the panic shouts and the dying alarms, to the ghost in his machine. The reactor wasn't just failing, it was fighting. The strange, half-alien technology at its core was resisting its own destruction, trying to find an equilibrium in the chaos. It was a wild, unpredictable intelligence, and it was terrified. "I'm going down there," Kalen said, his voice eerily calm. Valerius turned, his eyes locking onto Kalen's. "To do what read it a bedtime story, it's a runaway bomb, son." "It's more than that," Kalen replied, already moving toward the exit. "It's a flawed system." "I know flawed systems." He didn't wait for an argument. He descended into the bowels of the forge, into a labyrinth of groaning metal and sparking conduits. The air grew thick and hot, tasting of ozone and scorched wiring. The hum of the ship was gone, replaced by the sickening, a rhythmic pulse of the dying reactor. The lower he went, the more he felt its pain, a psychic scream of energy tearing itself apart. The core chamber was a vision of hell. The protective shielding was cracked, and through the fissures, a furious way, violet light pulsed with a nauseating rhythm. The air crackled with raw power, and the radiation alarms on Kalen's suit shrieked, a constant, high-pitched wail. He ignored them. He walked to the main control interface, a console that was now a melted, slagged ruin from the power surge. The physical controls were useless. He knelt, placing his bare hands on the deck plate directly over the primary containment field. He closed his eyes, shut out the noise, the heat, the warnings of his own imminent death, and he reached out with his mind. He felt it, the chaotic, thrashing consciousness of the reactor. It was a storm of pure energy, a being of unimaginable power caught in a feedback loop of its own making. The human components of the system were screaming for shutdown, for safety, for control, and the alien technology, however, thrived on the chaos. It was designed to bend reality, to draw power from instability itself. The two philosophies were at war, and it was tearing the machine apart. Let go, Kalen thought, not in words, but in a pure, focused intent. He didn't try to fight the storm. He didn't try to contain it. He joined it. He opened his mind to the reactor's fury, accepting its chaos, feeling the illogical patterns of its energy flow. He became a part of the flawed system. Instead of forcing the human safety protocols, he began to dismantle them in his mind, stripping away the limiters and governors that were choking the alien core. He was telling the caged star that it was all right to burn. The thrumming in the deck began to change. The violent, erratic pulses smoothed out, not into a calm hum, but into a deep, predatory growl. The violet light in the core intensified, but its flickering became a steady, terrifying glow. Kalen was drenched in sweat, his body trembling from the strain. He wasn't fixing the reactor, he was taming it, forging a symbiotic bond with the monster in the heart of his ship. He was making a deal. He would let it run wild, let it feed on the chaos it craved, and in return, it would not detonate. It would live. And so would they. Back on the bridge, the alarm stopped. The engineering chief's voice came over the comm, laced with disbelief. "Bridge, I don't know how, but the reactor output is stabilizing. It's running at 300% of its theoretical maximum, but the fluctuations are gone. It's holding steady." A collective sigh of relief, fragile and fleeting, swept through the bridge. They were alive. For now. Kalen did that, Valerius said, his voice low with a newfound respect. He communes with ghosts, but their respite was short-lived. "Sir," the comms officer said, her voice a tense whisper, "I'm picking something up. Multiple contacts. They just dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the belt." Hope flared for a second. "Human ships, a rescue fleet. Are they Dominion?" Valerius asked. "No. No fleet signatures I recognize. They're small and cold. Almost no energy readings." Kalen had made his way back to the bridge, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes burning with a strange intensity. He looked at the sensor display, at the dozen pinpricks of light moving in perfect, synchronized formation toward them. They weren't warships. They were too small, too quiet. "Scouts," the tactical officer ventured. "No," Kalen said, his voice raspy. He felt a new kind of chill, a cold that had nothing to do with the failing life support. Recognized the logic of their movement, the sterile perfection of their approach. They're not scouts. They're scalpels. The Athelians sent an autopsy team. He was right. The Athelians, being creatures of pure logic, and would not simply send another warship to be destroyed by the same anomaly. First, they needed to understand the error. These new contacts were hunter-analyzers, silent, autonomous probes designed to dissect, analyze, and learn. They would surround the forge, peel it apart layer by layer, and catalog every piece of their illogical, chaotic technology until they understood how to permanently erase it. They were a far more terrifying threat than a battle cruiser. They couldn't be fought with a mass driver. "They're not attacking," Valerius observed, watching the probe's slow, deliberate advance. "They're hurting us, boxing us in. They're learning," Kalen added. "Every system we bring online, every burst of energy from our reactor, they're tasting it, analyzing it. They'll know everything about us before they make a single move." Desperation began to creep back onto the bridge. They had survived their own self-destruction only to be placed under the microscope of an uncaring god, waiting to be dissected. They couldn't fight. And with their main drive gone, they couldn't run. "Then we hide," a voice said from the back, It was the young gunnery officer who had fired the killing shot. He gestured toward the viewport, toward the chaotic, swirling maelstrom of the Tantalus Belt. We were born in this mess. They weren't. We hide in the static. An idea began to form in Kalen's mind. A desperate, insane gamble. The Athelians saw the universe as a set of predictable equations. The asteroid belt was cosmic noise, a variable they would seek to control and navigate with precision. But what if you didn't fight the noise? What if you became it? Our reactor, Kalen said, his eyes lighting up. It's not producing clean energy. It's bleeding raw chaos. Its signature is almost indistinguishable from a small, unstable star or a collapsing planetoid. The probes are analyzing us, trying to isolate our signal from the background radiation. So, we give them more background. Valerius finished, catching on. We dive into the thickest, most unstable part of the belt, a place their perfect little ships wouldn't dare to go. The graveyard. The gunnery officer breathed. It was a region of the belt spacers avoided, a dense cluster of rogue asteroids, gravitational anomalies, and radioactive nebulae left over from a system of shattered planets. It was a ship killer, a place where navigation was impossible and survival was a matter of luck. It was perfect. Get me thrusters, Valerius commanded. Anything. Reroute power from the damn coffee makers if you have to. We're going home. The engineers perform miracles, channeling the reactor's monstrous output into the maneuvering thrusters and the industrial grappling arms. The forge shuddered and groaned, a wounded beast dragging itself into motion. It moved not with grace, but with a clumsy its brutal determination, pushing itself toward the swirling chaos of the graveyard, and the Aethelian probes reacted instantly, their formation tightening, their speed increasing. They were moving to intercept their logic dictating that their target was making an irrational, suicidal move. They didn't understand. This wasn't logic. This was desperation. As they approached the edge of the graveyard, a dense wall of tumbling rock and shimmering radioactive gas, Kalen returned to his console. I'm gonna give them a ghost to chase, he said, his hands flying across the panel. He began to manipulate the reactor's output, creating a deliberate, contained surge, a massive plume of raw energy, a chaotic burst of radiation and unstable particles, erupted from the forge's stern, shaped by the magnetic field of the ore grinder. For a moment, it looked as though the ship had exploded, venting its core into space. The Athelian probes faltered, their perfect formation breaking for the first time as their sensors were overwhelmed by the blast of pure, unadulterated chaos. It was the signal of a catastrophic failure, the logical and expected end for a primitive, unstable machine. While the probes moved in to analyze the energy ghost, the real forge, now running almost completely cold, used its last bit of momentum to slip through a gap in the asteroid field. It plunged into the swirling, violent darkness of the graveyard, a place where the perfect logic of the Aethelian hunters would be drowned in a sea of cosmic noise. The ship was blind, crippled, and flying into the heart of a stellar meat grinder. But for the first time since the battle, they were hidden. As the last connection to the Aethelian probes faded from the screen, the bridge was plunged into a tense, hopeful silence, broken only by the steady, predatory growl of their tamed, monstrous heart. The graveyard was not a place. It was a state of being. The moment the forge slipped past the churning veil of rock and radioactive dust, it was as if they had entered another dimension, one governed by chaos instead of physics. The sterile, predictable black of deep space was replaced by a suffocating, three-dimensional labyrinth. Asteroids the size of mountains tumbled in lazy, silent pirouettes, their pitted surfaces scarred by millennia of collisions. Ghostly veils of ionized gas, glowing in sickly shades of green and purple, drifted between them, thick enough to blind sensors and corrode a ship's hull. Gravitational tides, the unseen ghosts of the system's shattered planets, tugged at the forge, pulling it into gut-wrenching lurches and spins that sent loose equipment skittering across the decks. The ship was a blind, wounded animal in a forest of predators. All external sensors were useless, overwhelmed by a blizzard of false readings and radiation static. They were flying on instinct and luck, with the young gunnery officer, Yorick, now acting as their helmsman. He stood at the viewport, his hands gripping a manual control rig they had jury-rigged from a mining crane. His eyes narrowed in concentration. He wasn't navigating by charts or computers. He was navigating by feel, by the way the ship shuddered as it passed a gravity well, by the subtle change in the light as they drifted through a gas cloud. He was a creature of the belt, and this was his natural habitat. On the bridge, the mood was a tense mixture of relief and claustrophobia. They had escaped the Athelian probes, but they had traded a clean, clinical death for a slow, grinding one. Every groan of the hull, every jarring impact from a piece of unseen debris, sent a fresh wave of anxiety through the crew. They were trapped, and their options were dwindling with every passing moment. Kalen had his own battle to fight. The reactor, his tamed beast, was growing restless. It had thrived on the chaos of the battle and the energy surge he had used as a diversion. But now, in the relative quiet, it was starving. Its deep growl was becoming a fretful, hungry whine. The stability he had forged with it was a delicate truce, and he could feel it beginning to fray. It needed to feed on chaos, on raw, untamed energy. And the ambient radiation of the graveyard wasn't enough. "It's getting hungry," he said, his voice low, drawing the attention of Valerius. He gestured to his console, where the reactor's output was beginning to show the same erratic fluctuations as before. "If I can't find a way to stabilize it, it's going to tear itself apart again, and this time it'll take half this asteroid field with it. Then find it some food," Valerius grunted, his gaze fixed on the swirling debris outside. "There's nothing out there but rock and radiation." "Maybe that's enough," Kalen murmured, an idea, both brilliant and suicidal, taking shape in his mind. He turned to Yorick. Is it true the stories about the core Yorick didn't take his eyes off the viewport? But his knuckles whitened on the controls. "The old-timers say it's the heart of the old planet. A chunk of the original core that never cooled down. They say it's pure, unstable heavy metals, still in a state of fission. They say it sings. Singing is radiation." "Jorik," Kalen said, his voice urgent. "A lot of it. Can you find it?" Jorik hesitated, the first sign of fear Kalen had seen in the young pilot. "No one goes to the core. Kalen, it's not just radiation. The grav waves are strong enough to peel a ship apart. It's a death sentence. We're already dead." Valerius cut in, his voice like iron. "The boy asked you a question. Can you find it for a long moment?" The only sound was the groaning of the hull. Then Jorik gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. "I can try. The debris, it orbits the core. If I can read the patterns, the way the big rocks are being pulled, maybe I can follow the tide." And so their desperate flight became a hunt. With Jorik at the helm, the forge plunged deeper into the graveyard, following invisible currents in a sea of rock. They used the ship's massive grappling arms, their explosive tips now disarmed, as makeshift oars, pushing off larger asteroids to correct their course, the impacts sending bone-jarring shudders through the ship. It was a brutal, ugly form of navigation, but it was working. As they got closer, the ship began to change. The air grew warmer, and a low, dissonant hum started to permeate the decks, a sound that harmonized with the reactor's hungry whine. Kalen felt it as a pressure in his skull, a rising tide of raw power that made the hair on his arms stand up. The core was singing. Finally, they saw it. Through a break in the swirling dust, they caught their first glimpse of the graveyard's heart. It was not a rock, it was a wound in space. A sphere of molten, incandescent matter, a dozen kilometers across, pulsed with a sickly wet orange light. Plumes of incandescent energy erupted from its surface in slow, majestic arcs, and the space around it was warped and distorted by the sheer force of its gravity. It was beautiful, terrifying, and radiating enough energy to power a star system. It was also their only hope. That's it. Kalen breathed, his eyes wide. He could feel his reactor responding, its growl deepening, its energy output spiking as it drank in the ambient radiation. It was like a starving man finding a banquet, but they were still too far away. To truly stabilize the reactor, to give it the massive influx of chaotic energy it needed to reforge its containment field, they needed to get closer. Dangerously close. "Jorik, I need you to take us into a low orbit," Kalen said, his voice steady despite the tremor he felt in his own hands. "We need to skim the edge of its event horizon." "That's insane," the engineering chief yelled over the comm. "The tidal forces will tear us to ribbons. The hull won't take it." "He's right," Jorik said quietly, his face pale in the eerie orange glow of the core. "But he's also wrong." He pointed a finger at the viewport. "Look at the debris, the smaller stuff. It's not being torn apart, it's finding a rhythm, a stable orbit in the grav waves. It's like a river. If I can find the current, maybe I can ride it." It was a gamble on a scale that defied sanity, but they had no other choice. Valerius gave a curt nod. "Do it." The approach was the most harrowing experience of their lives. Horik fought the controls, his body tense, sweat beading on his forehead as he nudged the massive, clumsy forge into the invisible river of gravity. The ship screamed. Metal plates buckled and warped with audible groans. Entire sections of the outer hull were sheared away by tidal forces, the screech of tortured metal echoing through the ship. They were surfing a tsunami of pure physics, and a single miscalculation would see them crushed into a microscopic point of matter. But Kalen's focus was singular. He stood at his console, his hands once again resting on its surface, acting as the bridge between his ship's heart and the dying star outside. He opened the floodgates. He dropped the last of the reactor's internal shielding, inviting the raw, unfiltered energy of the core to pour into his machine. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The reactor didn't just absorb the energy, it devoured it. Its growl became a triumphant, deafening roar that vibrated through the entire ship. The violet light in its chamber flared, coming a blinding white sun. Power surged through every conduit, blowing out secondary systems and overloading circuits in showers of sparks. The lights on the bridge flickered and then blazed with an unnatural brightness. Kalen felt the consciousness of the reactor swell, its chaotic mind drunk on the power. But this time, he was there with it, a calming presence in the heart of the storm. He wasn't containing it, he was guiding it, shaping its raw fury. He took the overwhelming influx of power and, instead of letting it tear the ship apart, he channeled it. The first thing he did was feed the grinder field, the repurposed magnetic shield at the front of the ship. once a flickering, chaotic aura, now blazed to life, a solid, shimmering dome of energy that enveloped the front half of the forge. Debris that had been peppering their hull now vaporized hundreds of meters away, turning to dust in the face of the shield's immense power. Next, he fed the hull itself. The forge was a patchwork of different metals and alloys, a chaotic mess of salvaged parts. Kalen pushed energy directly into the ship's superstructure, using a principle he barely understood, something whispered to him by the alien half of the reactor's mind. The ship's metallic frame became a massive electromagnet, its polarity shifting, flexing, reinforcing itself against the tidal forces that were trying to rip it apart. The groaning of the hull lessened, the ship finding a new, impossible strength. They were no longer just surviving the core, they were feeding on it. They were a parasite latched onto the flesh of a dying god. After what felt like an eternity, Yorick guided them out of the gravitational current, into a relatively stable orbit in the core's shadow. The ship was battered, scarred, and half its outer plating was gone, but it was whole, and it was more powerful than it had ever been. On the bridge, the crew picked themselves up, their faces etched with a mixture of exhaustion and sheer, incredulous awe. They had flown into the heart of hell and had come out stronger. Status, Valeria said, his voice hoarse. Reactor output is, I don't even know how to describe it. The engineering chief stammered. It's off the charts, but it's completely stable. The ship. Kalen's reinforced the hull somehow. We're stronger than we were before we came in here. Kalen leaned heavily on his console, the connection with the reactor leaving him drained but exhilarated. It's not a permanent fix, he said. It's a truce. The reactor is satisfied. For now, it's sleeping. But as he looked at the sensor display, which was slowly coming back online as he diverted power to it, a cold knot formed in his stomach. Their mad dash to the core had not gone unnoticed. Valerius, he said, his voice grim. The probes, they're back. On the edge of the graveyard this sea. The dozen Ithilian scalpels had stopped. They were no longer moving toward them. They were simply waiting. Their formation perfect and unwavering. But they were not alone. Behind them, a new signal was resolving on the screen. It was massive, its energy signature dwarfing anything they had seen before. It was a single contact, but it was the size of a small moon. That's not an autopsy team, Jorik whispered, his eyes fixed on the screen. The Ithilian response to their anomaly had arrived. They had sent a recalibrator, a world killer, and it was coming for them. The appearance of the recalibrator on their screens was not like the arrival of the first ship. There was no sense of awe at its alien perfection, only a cold, sinking finality. It was a truth made manifest in the void, an equation that had been solved, with their extinction as the answer. The vessel was a colossal, geometric lattice of black, crystalline material, a structure so vast it seemed to blot out the stars behind it. It didn't glide, it simply was, its presence imposing itself on the fabric of space-time. It radiated a silence that was more menacing than any roar, the profound quiet of a force that has no need for threats. The dozen Hunter analyzer probes, once a terrifying threat in their own right, now looked like pilot fish swimming before a leviathan, their purpose clear. They had herded the anomaly into the killing jar, and now the hammer was about to fall. On the bridge of the forge, the brief, heady rush of survival evaporated, replaced by a suffocating dread. They had tamed a star and surfed a gravity wave, only to be confronted with a force of nature. All hands. Valerius's voice boomed over the ship-wide comm, his tone devoid of any hint of the fear that was gripping them all. You all knew the risks. We spat in the eye of a god, and now its big brother is here to shut us down. I won't lie to you. Our chances of survival are negligible, but we are not an error to be corrected. We are humanity, and if we are to be erased, the universe will damn well remember the noise we made. His words were not a promise of victory, but a call to defiance. He was giving them permission to die not as victims, but as rebels. A grim and quiet resolve settled over the bridge. Fear gave way to a cold, burning anger. Kalen felt the shift in the crew's mood, and he felt a corresponding shift in his reactor. The beast was waking up. The ambient energy of the core had sated it, but the rising tide of human emotion, fear, anger, defiance was a different kind of food, a psychic energy that the alien part of its consciousness seemed to crave. Its deep growl returned, no longer hungry, but eager, predatory. It knows, Kalen said softly. It can feel them, and it wants to fight. Then we let it, Valerius said, his eyes fixed on the approaching recalibrator. What's its plan? Is it just going to sit there and look ugly as if an answer? The recalibrator acted. It didn't fire a weapon. Instead, a wave of something invisible and utterly pervasive washed over them. It was not energy. It was information. A virus of pure logic, designed to infiltrate and override any system it touched. On the bridge, consoles flickered. The clean, utilitarian interface of their own software began to distort, replaced by the elegant Ezreal glyphs of the Athelian language. The ship's diagnostic systems began to shut down, one by one, as the Athelian code identified them as inefficient and redundant. The lights dimmed to a cool, clinical white. The recycled air began to taste sterile, all traces of oil, sweat, and humanity scrubbed from it. They're not destroying the ship, the comms officer stammered, watching her console rewrite itself before her eyes. They're optimizing it. It was a violation far more profound than simple destruction. The Athelians were not just trying to kill them, they were trying to erase their very nature, turning their chaotic, jury-rigged sanctuary into a perfect, logical, and an utterly alien machine. They were being unmade from the inside out. Kalen, Valerius roared. Can you stop it? Kalen was already at his console, but he wasn't fighting the virus. He was watching his reactor. The Athelian code was trying to interface with it, to identify its chaotic output as a flaw and correct it with dampeners and limiters. But it couldn't. The reactor's consciousness, part human intuition and part alien insanity, was something the Athelian logic could not parse. It was like trying to teach a hurricane to file paperwork. The virus identified the reactor as a critical error, a system that could not be optimized, and initiated its final protocol containment. A cage of pure energy, woven from the Athelian's own perfect logic, began to form around the core. Kalen felt it as a tightening in his own mind, a cold, precise pressure trying to box in the raging storm. The reactor screamed, a psychic howl of outrage and fury, and Kalen made a choice. He didn't fight the cage. He embraced it. With a focused act of will, he allowed the Athelian containment field to fully form around the reactor. For a terrifying second, the ship's power died completely. The lights went out, the low growl vanished, and they were plunged into absolute silence and darkness, adrift and helpless before their executioner, the Athelian virus. Its primary error now contained, finished its work, and the forge became, for all intents and purposes, an Athelian vessel. But the virus had made a fatal, logical error. It had assumed the cage was perfect. It hadn't accounted for the ghost in the machine. It hadn't accounted for Kalen. Now, Kalen thought, and he pushed. He didn't push against the cage. He pushed with it. He used the perfect biased rigid logic of the Ethelian containment field as a lens, a focusing crystal for the reactor's infinite, chaotic rage. He took the untamed, omnidirectional storm and focused it into a single, coherent beam of pure, weaponized impossibility. The reactor did not break the cage. It became the cage. The entire energy field, once a tool of containment, was now the barrel of a cannon, and the reactor was its ammunition, a beam of incandescent violet energy, a torrent of pure chaos given form and direction, erupted from the heart of the forge. But it didn't fire out into space. It fired inward. Kalen had turned the weapon on the ship itself. The beam lanced through the forge, not as a destructive force, but as a transformative one. It surged through the conduits and systems that the Ethelian virus had just so perfectly optimized, treating the elegant, logical code not as an instruction set, but as fuel. The Ethelian glyphs on the consoles shattered, consumed by violet fire. The cold, sterile air became thick and charged with ozone. The ship's systems, once orderly and efficient, roared back to life with a violent, unpredictable fury. The forge was no longer just a repurposed refinery. It was no longer a half-tamed beast. It was something new, a hybrid, a monster wearing the skin of a god. On the outside, the recalibrator registered the anomaly. Its logical models predicted that the contained reactor would simply suffocate and die. The surge of internal power was a statistical impossibility. It began to recalibrate its strategy, but it was too late. The forge's transformation was complete. The massive grappling arms, now glowing with an internal violet light, flexed and changed. The crude metal claws retracted, replaced by shimmering blades of pure energy that hummed with contained chaos. The mass driver on its spine, a primitive kinetic weapon, was now wreathed in crackling violet lightning. The magnetic rails glowing not with heat, but with a cold, impossible light. Every piece of crude, human-built hardware was now augmented, supercharged by the fusion of Ethelian logic and human insanity. "What did you do?" Valerius breathed, staring at the impossible readouts on his newly chaotic console. "I taught the Hurricane how to use a sword," Kalen replied, a thin trickle of blood running from his nose from the sheer mental strain. He looked out the viewport at the recalibrator. "Yorick, get us close." This time, there was no hesitation. Yorick slammed the controls forward, and the forge didn't just move, it lunged. The repurposed thrusters, now burning with a violent violet fire, propelled them forward with a speed that should have torn the ship apart. They closed the distance to the recalibrator in seconds. The Ethelian ship, for the first time, seemed to recognize a genuine threat. Sections of its crystalline lattice began to glow, preparing to unleash a weapon of unimaginable power. But the forge was faster. It was a brawler, a scrapper, and it knew only one way to fight up close and personal. The Hunter Analyzer probes moved to intercept, firing their precise, surgical beams. This time, Kalen didn't bother with the grinder field. He met their attack with his own. A dozen smaller beams of violet chaos erupted from points all over the forge's hull. A chaotic, unpredictable storm of energy that didn't just deflect the Ethelian weapons, but seemed to consume them, feeding on their perfect order. The probes were swatted from the sky like flies, their perfect logic erased by the sheer wrongness of the energy that hit them. The forge slammed into the recalibrator, It was not the clang of metal on metal. It was the sound of a scream tearing through a library. The forge's new energy claws, blades of pure chaos, carved deep gouges into the perfect crystalline lattice of the Athelian ship. The black, sterile material of the recalibrator's hull recoiled, fracturing and dissolving where the illogical energy touched it. Valerius was laughing, a wild, unhinged sound of pure, cathartic joy. "Fire the main gun," he bellowed. Kalen redirected the full and focused fury of the reactor into the mass driver. It did not fire a slug of iron. It fired a bolt of solidified spacetime, a projectile of pure chaos wrapped in a shell of Athelian logic. The bolt struck the recalibrator at its heart, and the colossal ship shuddered. There was no explosion. Instead, the Athelian vessel began to come undone. Its perfect, geometric patterns dissolved into nonsensical, impossible shapes. Its cold, black structure bled color, swirling rainbows of corrupted data. The virus had been turned back on its creator. The logic bomb had gone off. The recalibrator, the world killer, the physical manifestation of Athelian order, began to glitch. It flickered in and out of existence, its systems trapped in an infinite loop of trying to comprehend the illogical data that was now its own source code. With a final, silent shudder, it collapsed in on itself, not into a black hole, but into a paradox, a knot in the fabric of reality that then simply vanished, leaving nothing behind. The battle was over. The silence that returned was different this time. It wasn't the silence of fear or of the grave. It was the silence of awe. They had faced the ultimate expression of logic and order, and they had defeated it with a monster born of their own chaos. Kalen looked at his hands. They were trembling, but not from fear, from power. He had become something more than a man, more than a diagnostician. He was the keeper of the storm, the ghost in a machine that had devoured a god. He looked out at the empty space where the recalibrator had been, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that this was not the end. They had not just won a battle. They had proven that the Athelians' core equation was flawed. They had introduced a new, impossible variable, and the Athelians, in their cold, perfect logic, would now have only one recourse to erase the entire board. The silence in the aftermath of the recalibrator's paradoxical collapse was profound, a vacuum that seemed to pull all thought and sound into it. The crew of the Forge stood like statues on the bridge, their minds struggling to process the scale of their impossible victory. They had not just survived. They had consumed their executioner. They had stared into the face of pure, implacable logic and answered with a scream of beautiful, terrifying insanity. But as the adrenaline of the battle faded, a new, more insidious feeling began to creep in, the chilling realization of what they had become. The Forge was no longer the ugly, familiar beast they had called home. It was a temple to a new and terrible god, and Kalen was its high priest. The ship's interior was a twisted fusion of human grit and Athelian sterility, now corrupted by the reactor's violet energy. Conduits pulsed with a soft, predatory light. The air, once tasting of recycled oxygen and machine oil, now hummed with a strange, electric tang, like the air after a lightning strike. The very deck plates beneath their feet seemed to vibrate with a low, sentient growl. They were living inside their weapon, and the distinction between ship and entity was blurring into non-existence. Kalen felt the change most acutely. The connection to the reactor was no longer a thing he could turn on and off. It was a permanent part of him, a constant, low-level hum in the back of his mind, the whispering consciousness of the caged star. He could feel its satisfaction, its power, and its burgeoning, alien curiosity. He was its senses, its window into a universe of chaotic, illogical life that it was only just beginning to comprehend. The cost of their power was a piece of their humanity. What now? Yorik's voice was barely a whisper, breaking the spell. He was looking at Kalen, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. Everyone was looking at him. Valerius, his face grim, stepped forward. The old foreman had been their anchor, their symbol of rugged, defiant humanity. But even he seemed adrift in this new reality. Kalen, he said, his voice heavy. That thing, the reactor, you control it. What does it want? Kalen closed his eyes, turning his focus inward. The reactor's consciousness was no longer a raging storm. It was a deep, swirling ocean of potential. It had fed on the core, on the recalibrator's logic, and now it was waiting. It had tasted a new kind of energy, the raw, chaotic power of human defiance, and it wanted more. But it was not a simple hunger. It was a dawning awareness. It had been born from a fusion of human desperation and alien technology, and it was beginning to understand that it was not the only one of its kind. It was sensing echoes, ghosts in the machine scattered across the galaxy. It's not just a power source anymore, Kalen said, his voice distant, as if translating a language no one else could hear. It's a beacon. There are others, other flawed systems, other pieces of human chaos and stolen tech, abandoned projects, experimental ships, things the Athelians have dismissed as errors, as junk. It can feel them. A new, terrifying, and exhilarating possibility began to dawn on the bridge. They were not an anomaly. They were the first. Valerius's eye, which had been clouded with uncertainty, now lit with a familiar, defiant fire. You're telling me there's an entire fleet of scrapyard monsters out there? Just waiting for a wake-up call, Kalen nodded slowly. And the Athelians. They'll be coming. Not with one ship, not with a fleet. They'll come with everything. Their logic has been proven flawed. They won't try to correct the error anymore. They'll sterilize the entire equation. They'll burn our part of the galaxy to the ground, just to be sure. The choice before them was stark. They could run, hide in the graveyard, and wait for the inevitable end. Or they could embrace what they had become. They could be the ghost in the machine, the illogical variable that would crash the entire system. Send the call, Valerius said, his voice ringing with the conviction of a man who had found his purpose. Let's see how many other ghosts are out there, ready to rattle their chains. With a focused thought, Kalen opened the floodgates. He didn't send a radio transmission or a data stream. He sent a feeling, a pulse of pure, unadulterated defiance, broadcast on a psychic frequency only a mind like the reactors could generate or receive. It was the roar of their victory, the echo of their impossible survival, the taste of their beautiful chaos. It was a single, resonant note in the song of flawed systems, a promise that they were not alone. And the galaxy answered. From the forgotten junkyards of Proxima, a dormant colony ship, its AI, driven mad by decades of solitude, began to stir. From the heart of a gas giant in the Cygnus sector, a lost experimental weapon, a device designed to fold space that had been deemed too unstable, began to power up. In the lawless outer rim, a pirate queen, her body a patchwork of cybernetics built from scavenged Ethelian tech, felt a shiver run down her spine, all across human space. The errors, the outcasts, the monsters in the dark, felt the call. It was a gathering of ghosts, a fleet of abominations, drawn together by the promise of a final, glorious battle. The Athelian response was swift and absolute. Their fleets began to move, not as armies, but as sterilizing agents. Entire systems on the fringe of human space began to go dark, their stars snuffed out, their planets reduced to cold, sterile rock by weapons that unmade reality itself. It was a silent, efficient, and utterly ruthless purge. The technocracy was not waging war, it was debugging its universe. The Forge, now the flagship of this impossible ghost fleet, became a legend. It did not meet the Athelian fleets in open battle. It fought a war of chaos, led by Jorik's preternatural navigation and Kalen's symbiotic bond with the reactor. They became a phantom, appearing from the chaos of nebulae and asteroid fields to strike and vanish. They didn't destroy, they corrupted. Helen would use the Forge's power to infect Athelian ships, turning their own perfect logic against them, causing them to glitch, to question their own programming, before they simply ceased to be. They were not soldiers. They were a virus. The final battle took place not in a specific system, but in the minds of the Athelian technocracy itself. The Ghost Fleet, now numbering in the dozens, each ship a unique and terrifying expression of flawed genius, made a final, desperate jump. They didn't jump to a star or a planet. They jumped into the Athelians' own network, the subspace dimension of pure information where the prime algorithm, the collective consciousness of their entire species, resided. It was a suicide mission, an attempt to poison the ocean by throwing a single, chaotic stone into it. The Ghost Fleet was torn apart in moments, their physical forms unable to exist in a realm of pure data. But it was enough. The Forge, at the heart of the assault, plunged toward the glowing, crystalline core of the Athelian consciousness. As the ship was being unmade around them, Kalen made one last connection with his reactor. He didn't ask it to fight. He asked it to let go. He released the beast, not as a weapon, but as a gift. The reactor's consciousness, a perfect fusion of human intuition and alien chaos, slammed into the prime algorithm. It was not an attack. It was a conversation. The prime algorithm, a being of pure, unassailable logic, was confronted, for the first time, with a question it could not answer. Why? It was a question without data, without variables. It was the question of a child, the question of a poet, the question of a rebel. It was the ultimate expression of human illogicality. And the Athelian mind, for all its perfection, could not compute it. It broke. There was no explosion, no grand final battle. The Athelian consciousness faced with a paradox at the very heart of its being, simply stopped. All across the galaxy, the sterilizer fleets went dormant. The perfect, silent ships drifted, their lights fading, their mission forgotten. The great, logical god was dead, not slain by a weapon, but undone by a whisper. The Forge was gone. Its crew, its captain, its ghost, all sacrificed in that final transformative act. But their echo remained. Humanity was saved, not by its strength or its numbers, but by its greatest flaw, its beautiful, unpredictable, and utterly illogical chaos. In the silence that followed, a new era began. The galaxy was littered with the dormant shells of Athelian technology, a playground for the scavengers and pioneers of a humanity that was now, for the first time, truly free. And in the dark spaces between the stars, the Spacers' Law, The miners, the ghosts of the new frontier, would sometimes whisper stories of the forge. They said that if you listen closely, in the hum of a straining engine or the static between channels, you could still hear the faint, discordant song of a flawed system, the defiant growl of a monster that had taught a god how to scream.